thank you very much, Emma, for that introduction. And I assume that you can see my screen. Please stop me if it's not the case. So my job today is to give a little bit of background to this project and a brief overview of the South African component of this project. Now, one thing I can say about editorial cartoons, just maybe as a starting point, is we often think of cartoons as something that's meant to be funny, but certainly we've seen in this project as well that most are actually quite serious and some are even rather dark. But what I can say is that it's certainly entertaining and fun to study them and also very rewarding. So thank you very much for joining us for this glimpse into this project that looks at the role of editorial cartoons during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I asked one of my favorite South African cartoonists, Rico, to draw me a cartoon about this idea that cartoonists couldn't avoid the coronavirus, that it kind of infected their work as well. And I just love the way he illustrated it in this cartoon. So for me, this is kind of a starting point for this study. We don't often see science or scientific elements in editorial or political cartoons, but during COVID-19, that all changed to some extent. And that is what we wanted to look at. So we can define editorial cartoons as persuasive visual summaries that comment on current events. So they are very much tied to the news of the day. And they play a number of roles, including to reflect public sentiment and values, to influence public opinion, criticize and question, provoke and call to action, express hope and solidarity. They also provide us with a visual record of history. So these cartoonists often describe themselves as visual commentators, or political commentators. But I also like to think about cartoonists in the way that these two authors described them. The one back in 1981 already spoke about cartoonists as functioning subversives, waging war on the powerful, the exploiters, and the privileged. And Ferrell Haffergy, a leading South African journalist, referred to them as patriots who speak truth to power when necessary. Now, to effect their persuasive visual commentary, cartoonists use a number of techniques that you can see there on the screen. And it was particularly interesting to analyze how they used these techniques. And I focused specifically also on the use of anthropomorphism in one of sort of an earlier phase of the study. And if you doubt the relevance of editorial cartoons, this author says that you can look at the efforts to silence them from time to time, because they really poke at the powerful in society, they poke at the politicians, and they speak out against injustice. And therefore, from time to time, there are efforts to silence them. But where editorial cartoons are permitted, and that is also a barometer of press freedom. So in an earlier phase of this research, I just wanted to mention that briefly as a bit of background. I was involved in a study that looked at South African cartoons only, and we were particularly interested in how the virus itself was visualized. We wanted to understand why cartoonists use specific colors and exaggerations of the features of the virus, and specifically also anthropomorphism, giving the virus human characteristics. Now, just by quickly a way of background, this is what the virus, the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus that we have dealt with in the last 18 months really looks like under an electron micrograph. It's sort of a grayish, soft, almost a ghost-like image. But then scientists do add color and contrast, and they do this for clarity and to explain the shape and the structure of the virus, but also to add media appeal. And then we see, if we look at how this goes across different stages, that illustrators, when they draw the virus, they may add more detailed characteristics. And then we see that cartoonists typically go a step further. They add more colors, they exaggerate the features even a bit more. And the thing that cartoonists do that the scientists won't do is to add those human characteristics. So this part of our study showed that in the South African cartoons, 70% of the viruses in the cartoons had an evil look, like in this case, with sharp pointy teeth dripping with slime. And the most common form of anthropomorphism was also to add features like eyes and limbs, etc. And this part of the study was already published in December last year in the journal JCOM. So now on to the study that we're really talking about today, where we compared cartoons across 3 countries. And in this slide, I have captured 3 cartoons that were actually published on the same weekend. And it already tells us a little bit about how cartoonists responded differently, because of course, in different countries, there are different contexts, there are different political actors. The virus itself played out differently, the rate of infections and the effect on society across different countries. So in this example, the cartoon from Australia in the top right, there's a reference to Trump blaming China for the pandemic. Bottom right, there's a reference from the UK to Boris Johnson's impending illness, but also a reference to Churchill and the wartime mentality. And then on the bottom left, the City Press cartoon from South Africa, responding to people's irrational behavior at the beginning of the outbreak, in this case, hoarding goods, including toilet paper. So the methods that we applied in this study, of course, was content analysis, 6 weekend papers across 3 countries, 2 each, over a period of 18 months, 1 January 2020 to 30 June 21. And of course, we had to develop a detailed code book. We had to assure intercoder reliability. So we went through all those steps to ensure the robustness of the study. The 2 South African newspapers that were included in the study was on the left is the Sunday Times. It's a slightly more left-leaning paper published by Marina Holdings. And on the right, City Press, a slightly more moderate newspaper published by Media 24. Now, overall, we gathered all the cartoons that appeared in these 6 newspapers over 18 months, and we first of all looked whether they were related to COVID-19 at all. And what you can see in this slide is that in South Africa, the slightly lower percentage compared to the other countries actually were related to COVID-19. And when we asked whether these cartoons had COVID-19 as a primary message, you can also see that this was lower in South Africa compared to the other countries, considerably lower. And this is possibly, and I'm sort of, it's an educated guess on my side, that the news scene in South Africa is just so crowded by so many other things happening, and that's not necessarily a good thing, but we have so much crime and corruption and other issues taking place that COVID-19 wasn't as prominent in these cartoons. Cartoonists also had to respond to so many other things happening at the same time. Now, the cartoon that you see on the left there is one of the first ones in the data set from South Africa. It's the country's coat of arms, slightly modified to reflect public behavior or desired public behavior during the pandemic. And for me, this was quite sort of a positive start, using the coat of arms to mobilize people, to draw attention. And if you look carefully and you compare it with the actual coat of arms on the right, you see the secretary bird there in the middle, the national bird of South Africa, is wearing a mask. And the 2 figures in the bottom of the image they're not touching, they're not going to shake hands as they do in the original coat of arms. So of course, both of those refer to health behaviors that were asked of people during the pandemic. But we also see just 1 week later, this cartoon from the same cartoonist. For me, this has the message that this is a serious event. It's overtaking the whole globe, and it's going to change life as we know it. So also right from the start, an indication of the seriousness, the scope and the scale of this pandemic. We see across all 3 countries that the cartoons had a very strong political slant. Politics, politicians, political issues, political commentary dominated more than the other primary themes that we looked for. A little less so in South Africa, but still it dominated in South Africa as well. And if you look at the third theme there, crime, you can see that this was one that was quite unique to South Africa in terms of the percentage of cartoons that were mostly about crime. Here is an example, and I think it's a good example of the political nature of some of these cartoons. In this cartoon, the leader of the Economic Freedom Front, Julius Malema, on the left, is a very radical leader of a very radical political grouping in South Africa. He is congratulated by the virus, and the virus is also an EFF member, as you can see. Now, EFF members are known in South Africa for wearing red and wearing their red berets whenever they are in public and even in parliament. And the virus is congratulating Julius Malema as a certified super spreader because they were well known in the beginning for ignoring public health advice and legislation and organizing big public events with their followers. So he's being congratulated by the virus for helping to spread the virus. Here we can see some of the themes in a little bit more detail. And we can see here once again how the 2 newspapers in South Africa in yellow and orange had cartoons related to army and police and crime that were also, of course, COVID-19 related. So in South Africa, the pandemic and these issues of army and police and crime but came together in the cartoons. This is a rather sad cartoon called A Case of Over-Enthusiasm, and it refers to a so-called apology by the President Ramaphosa that the police were maybe over-enthusiastic in the way that they enforced lockdown regulations, but in fact, the way that they enforced lockdown regulations were actually very brutal and led to a number of deaths in the country. And in this case, the cartoonist is drawing attention to the police brutality and is likening the event, the death of Collins Kosa, to the Black Lives Matter protest in the USA and the death of George Floyd there. So this was quite a serious cartoon, and you can see there it gives some statistics about how many people were arrested for lockdown offences, and in many cases these were very poor people, like shopkeepers in informal markets who just tried to make a living and who were arrested by the police during the early days of the pandemic. Here's another example of linking COVID-19 with crime. Here's the South African COVID stats, but if you look carefully, it's not actually stats about infections or deaths, it's stats about corruption. How many active cases, how nil recoveries, millions in losses, hundreds of billions at risk, and most threatened are the poor Black communities in the country. So early on in the pandemic, President Cyril Ramaphosa started by having these, what he called family meetings, so these online and televised meetings with South Africans. And in one of these meetings, he had a bit of trouble getting his mask on, his face mask on position correctly. And then very soon the cartoonist responded with this cartoon saying that, while the president is battling to get his mask positioned, the hyenas, the corrupt officials would move in to steal some of the relief funds that he was making available. And these funds were already extremely limited to start with, and most of it was actually stolen or lost through corruption. So when we look at cartoons that were about COVID, but not primarily about COVID, COVID was the secondary message, we see that this was very prominent in South Africa. So other issues tended to dominate, but then there would be a secondary COVID theme. I think a good example is maybe this one. And this one is about prisoners being released, to avoid overcrowding in prisons. They released many people who were not really finished with their sentences, but they wanted to get empty out some of the prisons. And but the cigarette and the booze is still behind bars. And this relates to the fact that for many months during the pandemic, on and off, it was totally illegal to sell any tobacco or alcohol products in South Africa. The somewhat questionable rationale behind this was that, alcohol and tobacco ban would empty up hospital beds for COVID-19 cases. But this ban was, as you can imagine, very unpopular and did huge damage to the South African tobacco and alcohol industry, and especially also to the wine industry, and cost many jobs. Across all three countries, we saw that the cartoons mostly had a very negative tone. You can see in the red there, with very few being coded as neutral or positive. So here's a good example. The representations of the Grim Reaper often contributed to this very negative and dark and ominous tone. Here is the Grim Reaper flying over a South African landscape during Easter time. And it says that I'm not going to discriminate, but your system of inequality will. So again, a harsh reminder of the consequences of the social inequalities in South Africa. And by Christmas time last year, we were reminded that any Christmas cheer or holiday plans would also be restricted once again by COVID-19. And we were reminded also at the turn, at the end of the year, that we would probably live with this virus, into 2021, and who knows how long it will still continue. In terms of emotional appeal, the most dominant emotional appeal was anger, disgust, concern, followed by fear. And once again, you can see very few cartoons were happy or hopeful. So that was what, once again linked to the negative tone, of course. This for me was a good example from South Africa of a cartoonist expressing anger and disgust, where everyone in the country had to cope with a very thick sort of list or long list of lockdown regulations, sometimes very irrational, and ANC leaders kind of just did what they wanted to. Many cases called out by the media, but the leaders didn't really face any consequences for breaking the regulations themselves. In line with the finding that COVID-19 was highly politicized in the cartoons, we were, you can see here the number of cartoons that actually contained a politician. In most cases, an identifiable politician, and sometimes they could also be generic. A little less in South Africa than the other countries, but still you can see that politicians were highly prominent. For me, this was a good example as an illustration. President Cyril Ramaphosa is calling on his cabinet ministers to stop, and he tells them, whoa, you are flattening the wrong curve. Instead of flattening the curve of infections, you are flattening the curve of public goodwill towards lockdown restrictions. And this speaks to the fact that it started out fairly well in South Africa and people were behind the president, but as these very irrational and illogical lockdown regulations drew on and were extended, the public lost patience and turned against them. In terms of visual aspects, visual representations to do with COVID-19, here's a figure of the across the 3 countries of the virus, the face mask, PPE, personal protective equipment, and death and mortality, as it was found in the cartoons. You can see that these items were present across all 3 countries, following somewhat similar pattern across the three countries. But once again, an interesting difference that stood out in the South African data is that we had cartoons that really tried to expose misinformation and fake news more than in the other countries. It was very prominent. So one can hypothesize about the reason for that. Maybe the cartoonists perceive a specific objective or goal to try and do something about misinformation that was certainly very rampant in South Africa, in a very multicultural and very diverse country. So for me, this was a good example. My colleague Emma will talk later about how President Trump featured in these cartoons, but this one also had an American flavor. And although Trump is not present in this cartoon, it kind of has the flavor of him with a reference to COVID-19 and the cures, like disinfectant injections and hydroxychloroquine and ultraviolet enemas, etc. So being a long-time fan of Peanuts and Snoopy, I really thought this was an excellent cartoon and really captured it, commented on this rather eloquently. So once again, more cartoons in South Africa compared to the other countries had explicit educational content. In other words, the cartoonists made an effort to give people advice on how to behave during the pandemic. For me, this was a good example, be safe, wash your hands, stay home, be alert, sanitize, etc. And then you've always got that one character in the bottom right, the one who says, I don't care, no mask for me. So once again, commenting on the dangers of ignoring the health advice and encouraging people to adhere to the health recommendations. And another example here, I love this one where the dog is telling his owner, geez, but get with the program, a kind of colloquial expression, this geez, but, and the owner wants to shake his hands and the dog is actually one up and saying, I'm not going to touch you. And yes, you can see there in the newspaper, it refers to a COVID-19 update. And then the last example of this, for me, this one was really special. Nelson Mandela or Madiba looking down on South Africans and telling them a better world is in your hands, a well-known saying from him. But then he adds, please wash them first. So, of course, from a science communication perspective, we are all science communication researchers. We wanted to know whether scientists were present in these cartoons. And you can see that actually they were present, but at very, very low levels. And some of them were just generic health workers or scientists not recognizable necessarily. And the lowest in South Africa compared to the other 2 countries. This was a good example for me of a generic health worker. And I think this is also a powerful cartoon with, once again, a war metaphor, sort of likening COVID-19 to World War III. And where we had soldiers before, we now had health workers fighting in the front lines of this particular war. Later in the pandemic, there were cartoons about, criticizing the slow vaccine rollout. And in this case, Salim Abdul Karim, so the AK on his shoulder, he's one of South Africa's prominent scientists in the pandemic. And he is seen along with the political leaders kind of taking their time as, with the vaccine rollout, not in a hurry at all. So they're saying now, just now, now. And now is a South African expression for saying, I'll get to it, but don't rush me. So clearly a critical comment on the vaccine rollout. And sadly, even vaccine money and money for vaccine awareness ended up in corrupt hands. In this case, the health minister himself, who is also a medical doctor, got involved in a very big scandal where money that was put aside for vaccine awareness was channeled to his friends and family and contacts in a company called Digital Vibes. And this scandal is still ongoing. So I think I can summarize by saying editorial cartoons definitely contributed to media content and therefore to public discourse about the pandemic. It differs across countries because it sticks to the flow of news according to a different virus clock and content in each context. And politics did definitely dominate with relatively little scientific or educational content, but visual references to science, for example, the virus, are definitely present. And you are most welcome to get in touch if you have any further questions about this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina, for introducing the project and the South African context. I'm going to hand over now to Michelle, who's going to talk about the Australian context.
Thanks, Emma. Excellent. Okay, so as Marina said, we set out to explore the way that these cartoons were represented in the 3 newspapers. And one of the things that became really apparent to us was that it's difficult to analyse some aspects of political cartoons when you aren't a resident of that country. So, for example, here in the first Australian cartoon that Marina put when she was talking about cartoons from the same time, there's a reference to China. And this cartoon, on the face of it, could be read as simply castigating the US and Trump for blaming China for the virus. But for those not in the know, Australia has an ongoing difficult relationship with China in terms of being the major trading partner, and these relationships are being played out also in this cartoon. So we used a similar content and analysis approach to study our cartoons, and the Australian study focused on the 2 national newspapers, so one conservative and one more moderate, which regularly featured the editorial cartoons. And these cartoons were produced by 2 different cartoonists, one for each paper. And so the style is very consistent within each paper, but very different. And it does mean that this study only gives us a picture of the approach taken. We can expect that individual cartoonists will have their own perspectives in other papers in Australia. But as I said, there's some nuances with themes, which I think are quite difficult to pick up if you're not familiar. So, for example, recognising local politicians. And the data we're going to present is collected from January 2020 to the end of June 2021. And here's a cartoon from the Sydney Morning Herald on the same day as the previous one I showed from the Australian. And this cartoonist depicts a lot of our state premiers. The state premiers were a big feature. And here, the Premier of New South Wales, who was quite prominent throughout the Australian pandemic, is being congratulated very early on in the pandemic for keeping the state safe from COVID. And here she's dodging all sorts of political landmines because of the COVID-19 management reputation. This cartoon really liked drawing the virus. So if we look at the percentage of cartoons in the data set that reference COVID-19, here's a comparison for all of 2020 up until June 2021. And any cartoons that mention COVID-19 in some way are in the data set. And you can see that COVID-19 didn't dominate the content of political cartoons, but there was a substantial number. So 68 out of 156 cartoons. And many of the cartoons explicitly criticised leadership. So here we've got a cartoon from the Sydney Morning Herald very early on, criticising the US handling of the COVID-19 crisis. And Emma's talking about Trump representation. So as she'll show, Australian cartoon set, it was quite a relevant and primary theme. In this cartoon, we see COVID-19 content that's more implicit, And this cartoon is labelled as COVID secondary content for us. So it's more explicitly criticising the handling of a particular issue arising from COVID policies in Australia. And as you can see, COVID itself is not specifically stated, but at this time there was considerable concern about cruise ships and passengers that were stuck on board off the coast of Australia. So cruise ship passengers were one of the biggest spreaders of COVID in Australia before they were banned, and we took an elimination strategy. And here the cruise ships are contrasted with the refugee boats. The Australian Prime Minister is very proud of stopping refugee boats making it to Australia, and he set up a group of police called Border Force, colloquially referred to as Border Farce. And here the Border Farce people in their uniforms are showing we've got to stop small refugee boats, but it's okay for large international cruise liners to come to Australia. So some of those hypocrisies around policies pointed out during the time we were collecting the cartoons. So the main feature of cartoons from the two different newspapers, we can see that politics, particularly censorship criticising leadership, dominates. So cartoons about the economy are also widely prevalent. And the Week in Australia had a focus on society and social consequences. Unlike other countries, Australia has little focus on health in the cartoons. And I'll talk through some of these themes we see now. So in Australia, the focus on impact on social consequences of lockdowns, it was the impact on public holidays. So public holidays are taken very seriously in Australia, and here Easter and the impact on Easter is represented, and here Christmas. It seemed as though as soon as there was a holiday, Australians' Christmas plans are ruined, and Australians are big travellers across borders, and borders were closed. So it seemed to be very disturbing. Politicians, as I said, appeared frequently in cartoons, and the Prime Minister featured heavily, but as I said, not as prominently as our state premiers. We've got depictions of the Prime Minister, and they were altogether negative, with a focus on failing regarding the economy, but also bringing our states together around COVID-19 policy. Essentially, the Australian states ignored the Prime Minister's calls to reopen and to shut their reopen their borders, as well as removing various lockdown restrictions, which were different from each other. So here you can see that he's cut off. And in Queensland, we're still cut off from the other states of Australia. So our borders are closed, and Western Australia's in the same situation. We're opening up closer to Christmas. So even though the Prime Minister has announced that we are open to international travel, we're still not open to other states of Australia. In Australia, like South Africa, the vaccine rollout, it was represented as coming late, and here the slowness of the snail. And it was also connected to public impatience and stress associated with those international border closures. There's a lot of people who are cut off overseas or wanting to get out and can't. 7 of the cartoons had a focus on China, and 2 of them specifically referenced the idea that COVID-19 was created in the lab and featuring the head of China's Communist Party. So this COVID-19 origin story has been popular among the Australian politicians, calling for reviews and some sort of expose in China, and we've seen that represented in cartoons. As I said, the Australian cartoon set had quite a focus on state premiers, but this was uneven. So the Weekend Australia, which is a conservative paper, focused on criticising a range of Australian state politicians from left-leaning parties. So the Sydney Morning Herald, based out of Sydney, focused on the Premier of New South Wales. Even though it's read nationally, the political was a local focus. So the Australian cartoons in the Weekend Australian were particularly critical of Dan Andrews, the Premier of Victoria. Melbourne and Victoria is reported to have had the longest lockdown in the world, and he has been nicknamed Dictator Dan by a number of people resistant to lockdowns, and there's been quite a bit of quite a few marches that are still happening around those measures. Here's another cartoon in the series looking at contrasting Melbourne with what was happening in Sweden at the time, and you can see, supposedly the contrast, the bleakness of this cartoon. I showed this cartoon earlier. It's the State Premier of New South Wales early in the pandemic as the hero. So she was represented like that for a long time as the person bringing New South Wales economy together with health. But here she is 5 months later trying to hold the crumbling COVID-19 protection strategy together as COVID started to take hold. Here in June 2021, you can see her represented in a hypocritical stance to COVID. So she's refusing to announce a lockdown under pressure of economic interests, but encouraging people to stay home. So Australians have had a very different experience of COVID compared to other countries. Another element we studied, as Marina said, was the visual representation of the pandemic. And here we see the data on virus, face mask, PPE, death and mortality. And the cartoonist from the Sydney Morning Herald, as I said, he was more likely to include the virus, I think because he liked drawing it, but didn't include elements of death or mortality, and rarely a face mask. We don't see many face masks. They started to appear more often in the Australian cartoons in 2021, but they're rarely together in the set. So here, the Sydney Morning Herald cartoonist, in the first half of 2020, the virus was often accompanied with Trump in denial. And here's one with the Australian Prime Minister and the Treasurer in the same sort of position that Trump was presented in earlier, not seeing the wave of coronavirus coming. By the end of the year, the New South Wales Premier was depicted as losing the COVID battle. And here's one of the few examples we've got of a cartoon that has a face mask as well as a representation of the virus. And it's from The Australian. And it's, again, Dan Andrews, the Premier. And you can see the virus on the woman's dress there. It's rather subtle. You have to look a little harder to spot it. Police enforcement was another theme, drawing on media reports about lockdowns and police crackdowns on mask wearing. And in 2021, cartoons started to appear that included people in face masks, as I said, but it was where COVID-19 content was a secondary theme. So here, Dan Andrews again in Victoria, and this is about health and education in Australia, because health and education is controlled by the states, and he is pointing out the state of Victoria's treatment of university students coming from overseas, treating them very poorly when it's time to look after them. PPE equipment featured in only 3 cartoons, and all in the first 3 months of the pandemic and in public settings, so indicating some political or public fear of the virus. So there were no depictions of medical professionals in PPE throughout the Australian set, and probably because Australia didn't have the same hospital crises that other countries faced. Representations of death were also rare when we looked at our comparison of cartoon sets. When death was represented, it was an inevitability, but here we see yeah, here we see this, it's not this ominous figure that we see in others. So here's a cartoon pointing out, again, some hypocrisies around the problems with the gathering rules. So people can't gather for recreation at the beach, but they can gather to attend a funeral over summer. So as I said, death for Queenslanders is represented as related to the borders opening, and a lot of states had this, the Northern Territory, Western Australia. So here's the Premier of Queensland keeping the border to New South Wales closed in May last year. When it started to get warmer, people in the southern states of Australia want to have their holidays in the warmest part, and tourism operators in Queensland were suffering. But you can see here the caravans lined up, you know, at the border wanting to cross, and then we've got the economic death of all the Queensland tourism operators. So when we did see death represented, it was a political death. It was related to harm to politicians. So in sum, what we see in these cartoons is the politicisation of COVID-19. We see Australian politicians, the impacts of international politics, and local impacts beyond health, so lockdowns in the economy. If there was a good demonstration for science communicators that it's not about the science, then this is it. The focus on Trump shows the impact he was having on Australia at the time, and Emma will talk more about that. COVID-19 was also a focusing event for issues simmering beneath surface of the time. So, for example, Australia's relationship with the US and China, and those state-based power dynamics, as I said. So I'll close with this cartoon that I think still resonates for Australians, getting our head around living with COVID. And in some ways, it's difficult for many Australians to imagine what living with COVID will be like, because we haven't had any practice at it, which I think is why it's powerful in this local context. This idea of living with COVID has seemed very absurd. And yeah, I think we watched a lot of parts of the world try different things, but it's been a rather academic exercise for us. And I think it's one of the reasons why COVID-19 may not dominate editorial cartoons as it does in other countries.
Thank you, Michelle. And so we'll move swiftly on to the UK, and I'll ask Elena to pick up with the UK set.
Okay, so I'm Elena. I'm a research fellow at the University of West of England, so I work with Emma. And my talk will focus in particular to the UK. And so I won't really talk about all the aspects of these cartoons, but I want to focus on some main topics, which are the presence of politicians and also of death in British editorial cartoons. And when I talk about politicians, most of the time you will see I'm actually talking about the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who's also depicted in this cartoon. So for our analysis, we've focused on these two Sunday newspaper. One on the left is The Observer, and it's more progressive, liberal also in its readership, while the Sunday Telegraph instead is more conservative. And these two images are actually from the same date. So you're talking about the end of March of 2020. And you can already see the differences, for example, in the image of a front page. On one hand, of a nurse doing the driving test for the COVID, and on the other, instead, of the Duchess working from home. So it's quite interesting how these differences are also present in the cartoons shared by this newspaper. So the Observer, for example, the cartoons of the Observer, they focused a lot on political themes. And we're also seeing this, for example, in the charts showed by Marina. And but actually, the main theme was often Brexit. So it was interesting to see how the coronavirus pandemic as a crisis and Brexit as a crisis were often represented together. And actually, the Observer had quite a strong critic against the leadership of a country, so specifically Boris Johnson, on how both the coronavirus crisis and the Brexit crisis were handled. In that cartoon, you can see two symbols that represents the UK, that's the lion, and the Britannia, so the main island, that's represented by the Roman, and how they're basically being swallowed by the coronavirus hole. So this again emphasizes how much the leadership is criticizing the handling of the pandemic. So while the Observer has this Brexit topic that emerges very often, the Sunday Telegraph instead focused a lot more on the social implications of the pandemic. So not being able to go on holiday, for example, not being able to go to the pub. And in the cartoon I'm showing here, there is this critic of the unclear rules and regulation on whatever last summer, summer from 2020, whatever we could travel or not, we had to quarantine and so on. So, you know, it's rather than the health impact of the pandemic, the focus is more on the impact on the individual freedom of the citizens. And going ahead with the Telegraph, what I found very interesting is also how they tended to downplay the coronavirus pandemic. And I quite like this cartoon on the left to show what I mean. So, you know, there is the little kid saying, "Oh, mom, there is a monster under my bed." And the mother is more like, "Oh, you just have to hide under the cover for the rest of your life." So the idea of, you know, this was with all the lockdowns last year. So the idea of, you know, keeping the lockdown and the restriction and trying to avoid the virus to spread as much as I can is a bit of a way of downplay, like, you know, saying the virus is not that dangerous as it looks or as you make it look. And again, this is the one on the right is an example of, again, how individual freedom is so important, also discussed in the Sunday Telegraph. And here is another symbol of the UK, which is the pub. And that cartoon was basically when the pub were reopened again last year, and also swimming pools and gyms. And so it's almost a celebration of having some of the freedoms back. The Observer, as I said, focused a lot on Brexit instead, and they had two ways of representing Brexit in relation to coronavirus pandemic. So that's what was interesting, that the two things were represented together. So one of the reasons why Brexit was probably so so represented, it's because in the end of 2020 or last year, the UK officially left the European Union. And there was quite the pressure to have some final deals before completely leaving it. So that's why in many cartoons from the Observer, we have Brexit represented as the elephant in the room, as a problem that needs to be solved, but because of the pandemic and other political issues, has never actually been addressed. And sometimes instead of the Brexit was represented as the Brexit blunder, so as a troll. And again, you know, as this big problem that is still there because it hasn't been addressed. Consider that the Observer has a very anti-Brexit stance, so they've always been in favor of remaining in the European Union. And that's why they tend to portray Brexit in a very negative way. In the case of the Telegraph, of the Sunday Telegraph, for example, Brexit is also shown as a liberation. So there is again a focus more on individual freedom and the freedom from the European Union. But one of the topics that actually came out quite often in the UK is the representation of death, like the Green Reaper. And the previous cartoon also, we can also see the Green Reaper there. But again, there is a difference between so there is quite a representation in the UK cartoon, but actually it's mostly the Observer cartoons, not the Sunday Telegraph. And this representation is often around, is often like a green reaper rather than, for example, tomb or other kind of symbols. We think one of the reasons why in the UK, and especially the Observer, why there are so many representations of death is probably because of a high number of cases, but especially of deaths that we had in this country, in comparison, for example, to Australia. So we are talking about hundreds and thousands of deaths only in the UK. But when we look about the representation of coronavirus and death in the British cartoons, so actually the first time that these two were together is in the cartoon from January on the top left. And the coronavirus was actually depicted as one of the four horses of the apocalypse, and together with climate change, deaths, and Brexit. So it's always this Brexit topic coming around. But in all the other cartoons, coronavirus and death were basically both represented by the Green Reaper. And you've seen, for example, before how coronavirus was written on the scythe. So one of the interesting things about the Observer is how the cartoonists often focus on how badly the pandemic was handled. And that's something I mentioned before. But they meant handling badly because of the number of deaths and cases that we had in the UK. So rather than the focus is just on businesses and economics, it focuses much more on the health impact of the pandemic. And there is a strong critique on how the lockdown was started too late, how the borders were closed too late, or how the restriction had been eased too soon. And we can see, for example, in the last cartoon on the top right, how from coronavirus, the scythe instead became Delta variant. This was a beginning of the summer this year. And basically, again, is a critique of how they were trying to ease restriction and allow people to travel again, even if we had quite a few cases of the Delta variant. And at that time, there was also the problem of not knowing whether the vaccine was effective or not. So there is a constant critique, basically, on the handling of the pandemic. So the last thing I want to talk about is about politicians. And as I mentioned at the beginning, when I mean politician, I often talk about Boris Johnson. So most of the cartoons from both Observer and Sunday Telegraph represent at some point a politician, mostly UK politician, and basically 80% of these cartoons are about Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister. Consider that when we look at scientists, I think we found maybe 5 cartoons in total. So there is this really big difference in how much the cartoons were politicized. We think that the reason why Boris Johnson is so prevalent is because of the way the political system in the UK is structured. So the Prime Minister in the UK has a lot of power, especially in comparison with other countries, like, for example, Italy. So whenever a decision is made, we tend to talk about the Prime Minister, rather than, for example, the whole government. And again, the Observer has a very negative way of portraying Boris Johnson, and not only because of how the pandemic was handled and the restrictions, but also because of Brexit. So again, these two topics always tend to come together. And even if the vaccine rollout was very efficient and it started really well and very early and everything, but still the Observer still criticized Boris Johnson because of all the other bad eggs that it has in the basket, like, again, Brexit, of course, but also racial equality, for example. So there is a constant critic. But again, consider that the current Prime Minister is from the Conservative, while the Observer is instead more leftist. The Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph, has still criticized sometimes the Prime Minister, but actually at the beginning it tended to have a positive portrayal of Boris Johnson. So at the beginning of the pandemic, for example, we have Boris Johnson as Winston Churchill, And consider that Winston Churchill is almost a hero in the UK. So this is actually a really positive metaphor. And, there's also this comparison with the pandemic and the war, the Second World War. However, the way Boris Johnson was portrayed became slowly negative because of all the lockdown restrictions and the impact on businesses and especially on social life. And this is something Michelle also showed, the difference between, for example, Victoria and Sweden. Here we have a difference between the UK and Sweden. So while Sweden didn't have any restriction whatsoever, and that's why it's represented as the elephant in the room, Boris Johnson instead always had this lockdown 1, lockdown 2, lockdown 3, and so on. So it's basically, again, a critique of the lockdown system, but in a different way from the observer. Again, it's more the impact on the social life. The way Boris Johnson was portrayed, again, became positive with the vaccine rollout because it was very successful. And you can see here how, thanks to the vaccine, we can open the pubs again. So the pub is quite the symbol in the UK, and especially regarding, the social life. It's a bit of a symbol of social life. This is the last thing I want to talk about. So when I talk about the UK, normally I include England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. So it's the 4 countries that form the UK. But most of these cartoons actually focused only on England, and which is also the biggest population. These numbers are related to the population for each country. But for example, there's never really comparison with Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, even if each country could change a bit, or at least could have different policies regarding the restrictions, the coronavirus restrictions. But there was never really a comparison with them. And also politicians from these countries are basically missing in relation to the coronavirus pandemic. And we think, again, this is probably because of how the political system is structured. So Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, they all have a parliament. England doesn't have one, but the government of the UK is based in England, and England is also basically the biggest country among all. So that may be why most of the cartoons actually focus more on England rather than the UK as a whole. So basically, in all this presentation, the main message I'm trying to convey is how much the political system of a country and the political orientation of a newspaper, of a cartoonist, changed the way the pandemic was portrayed. But I leave now the room to Emma for the final presentation.
Thank you very much, Elena. So I was tasked with looking across the countries at the way in which Donald Trump features in the cartoons. And I hope that you've already picked up from the presentations earlier on that while we encountered a lot of politicians within our data sets, we didn't actually, they tended to be politicians from within our own countries. So there was a relative absence of politicians on an international basis, with the exception of Donald Trump. In China, there were some representations of Xi Jinping. He didn't really feature anywhere else. There were a couple of cases where we have a few other politicians represented in South Africa, but they are predominantly South African. And in the UK, if it isn't a UK politician, it's a European politician that we see, or it's Donald Trump. And so on that basis, we thought it would be interesting to look at how Donald Trump was presented throughout the pandemic. And while on this set of cartoons, I'm going to focus on those in which COVID is also represented, for the purposes of this analysis, we actually looked at all the cartoons that feature Donald Trump. So not just those cartoons that also have COVID content. So when we looked at that, we first of all looked at how many cartoons are there altogether that have Donald Trump featured. And you can see that he features quite highly in both Australia and South Africa, and a little bit less in the UK. And then we looked at whether he was represented with COVID-19. And the second two categories are not mutually exclusive. So he could have been represented with COVID-19 and the election, but I've separated them out here. And as you can see, really in Australia, that's where we see Donald Trump primarily featured in the context of COVID-19. And then when it comes to the election itself, he appears across all three countries in pretty much a similar pattern. And so we'll look at all of those in this presentation. So when we came to look at how Donald Trump was represented, there are a couple of key themes that emerge. The first of these was ignorance. And in all of the data sets, there are portrayals of Trump as ignorant. And that occurs both in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and also in the context of the election. So in the case of this cartoon, the one on the left from Australia, we can see Donald Trump ignoring the COVID crisis. This is the cartoon that Michelle showed earlier. And it's focusing, really, he's focusing more on his image and taking his supporters along with him than taking action. I think that's the main message that comes out of that. And the caption, because it's quite difficult, I think, probably to read, the caption says, "All hail the Commander-in-Chief," further referencing, I think, his narcissism. In the UK, we have a cartoon that does reference COVID-19, but is really more about the election. And here we see ignorance is explicitly referenced in relation to Donald Trump ignoring the coronavirus pandemic. But the cartoon also illustrates how he's handled the election, and in particular the way he sets up the election as potentially fraudulent from quite an early point in the campaign by suggesting that postal votes might be compromised. And in this cartoon, from the Observer, Liberty is here seen criticising Donald Trump for his ignorance and electioneering. And in case it's difficult to read, the caption says, "Looks like you're pussy-grabbing, immigrant-demonising, dictator-pandering, climate change denying, tax dodging, white supremacist supporting, coronavirus ignoring days are almost over, Mr. Reality TV Show President." Quite a mouthful. As the election progresses, we do see a few images of Biden, but not very many. I mean, he does appear in the election campaign, as in this cartoon, but he doesn't particularly feature heavily compared with Trump. Staying with the ignorance theme, we've got another couple of cartoons from Australia here. And this really was a big theme for the Australian cartoonists in relation to the pandemic and the way Donald Trump was portrayed in this context. So on the bottom, we have a cartoon portraying Donald Trump as Colonel Custer, referencing the famous battle in Montana known as the Battle of Little Bighorn against Native Americans, and in which he and all his men were killed, kind of suggesting that Trump is just, blind to what's going on around him, and that this is going to create significant public health harm. So he's failing to recognize the problem and is allowing people to die as a result. In the slightly later cartoon, also from the Sydney Morning Herald, we see Trump being shown as Napoleon and being evicted from the White House. And his hat here says, "Ignorance is strength." So if I don't see it, it can't be happening. And this cartoon is clearly making an analogy with the dictatorial approach of Napoleon and the way in which he was exiled from France with Donald Trump's attempts to stay in the White House. Another area where we see an association between Donald Trump and the pandemic is in the context of misinformation. And this was particularly a theme in South Africa. It also emerged in Australia. And I think in the context of the cartoonists, Donald Trump provided a lot of opportunity to critique misinformation, because he's often shown with things like disinfectant and bleach, referencing his suggestions that would be a good approach to protecting yourself from, just drink some bleach to protect yourself from the coronavirus. And the cartoon on the left, he's seen peddling misinformation, and as a result, the US death tolls rising because of the communications that he's offering to the public. So we've got those 2 bottles of ineffective remedies that he promoted, and also with him seen as promoting misinformation about vaccination. So again, what we see here is that the cartoonists are saying, you know, this is a man with significant world leadership role, leader of the largest economy, who is peddling a bunch of toss information. In the second cartoon, it's similar. On this is from the Sydney Morning Herald again. We see Donald Trump as public enemy number 1. And again, it's about the kind of the power that he has beyond the borders of the US to an extent here. And he receives this nomination because of the misinformation that he's peddling, which is detailed in the coronavirus blobs that follow him. So, for example, claiming that it will be gone by Easter, or that it's a Democratic hoax. And thus we see Donald Trump shown as a major source of misinformation in a way that doesn't seem to occur with the national leaders portrayed when the newspapers are portraying their own national leaders. He has a kind of particular and special role in the peddling of misinformation within these data sets. And perhaps there is an element here of being able to criticize someone else's leader in a way that perhaps you can't quite criticize your own leader. Although clearly most of the cartoons are criticizing leadership in some way. But interesting to speculate if perhaps he gets a special role of world leader of misinformation, in part because he isn't the government for the country the cartoonists are working in. Blame is also an issue here, which relates to misinformation in a slightly different way. But here from the Sydney Morning Herald, we see Donald Trump trying to shift the blame onto others. In this case, it's one of the few representations of Dr. Fauci, although he was clearly prominent in other media reporting. He didn't really feature in the cartoon set, but here he's being shown as being blamed for the pandemic by the president. And I think, you know, blame is kind of one of the things that comes out of this is the leaders trying to, we see this in a few other contexts around national leaders trying to blame somebody else for the problem or for the impacts of the pandemic. In all the data set, we did find masks to some extent, but in the context of Donald Trump, they're very specific. So he is never shown wearing a mask except on a couple of very specific occasions. So in this cartoon from the Sunday Times in South Africa, we see him in a Ku Klux Klan face mask, where he is seen to be promoting also a number of misinformation items with bleach and hydroxychloroquine. I think the link to the Ku Klux Klan here is probably a reference to Donald Trump's links with white supremacist groups or extreme right groups in the US, and the timing linking to the Black Lives Matter, which was getting underway at this point. So there's a kind of implicit reference here around masks, but only when the mask suits me. In the other cartoon from the UK Observer, again, Donald Trump is seen as never wearing a mask, but here he's actually caught COVID and is in hospital, watching himself on television, talking about the fact that you don't need to wear a mask, and he's really poking fun at Joe Biden, who does wear masks, even though, of course, now Trump has suddenly got the effect of not having worn the mask. He's caught COVID and had to spend time in hospital. So Donald Trump and Boris Johnson were the two leaders who caught COVID during the time that we were looking at and collecting cartoons. And I thought it was interesting just to look at how this was represented in the South African cartoons, which did pick up both of these issues. So on the left, we have Boris Johnson in hospital. So this is early in the pandemic. This is March 2020. So really when things are just getting going. And this is a cartoon which is really supporting the local leadership. So you can see in the image Donald Trump, Bolsonaro, and Boris Johnson in hospital. And Boris Johnson is on the phone asking for to speak to a real leader who is referenced as Cyril Ramaphosa. So I think here you've got an example where the cartoonist is saying, thank goodness we haven't got these other leaders who are really being quite hopeless in their managing of the pandemic. And similarly, I think an interesting take on Donald Trump's illness from the City Press in October of 2020, where the unpopularity of Donald Trump is really evident. So here the bird is saying, you know, oh, Donald Trump has tested positive for COVID, and the squirrel said it's good to hear anything positive about him. So very tongue-in-cheek representation of the leaders and how Trump is perceived on the international scene. Finally, I think it's worth mentioning that in the UK, up until the pandemic, Boris Johnson was really presented as a little Donald Trump in many of the left-leaning newspapers. So here in The Observer, we see Boris as being kind of portrayed as a little sidekick of Donald Trump. He's kind of, it's implicit that what he's doing is trying to, that Boris is trying to emulate Donald Trump, but from the Observer's perspective, this is not somebody to emulate. And it's notable that as the pandemic got underway in the UK, and Boris took, albeit belated, but did take action, but Trump did not, that these links kind of separated. And at this point, then the Observer really goes down that route of connecting the coronavirus pandemic and the Brexit issues that were going on in the UK. So intertwining that and separating out that sort of former link or former suggestion of Boris Johnson as being just a little bit like a little toddler Trump. Finally, I said I would look at the more general, the electoral representation of Donald Trump in the cartoon. So sort of separate specifically from the pandemic itself. And what we found in the cartoon set was quite a number of references to Donald Trump attempting to steal democracy. These cartoons don't reference the COVID-19 pandemic particularly, but they do explore the issues in the run-up to the election and the handover of the president. And it is worth saying that once Joseph Biden becomes president, the number of cartoons, the reference to Donald Trump in cartoons pretty much stops in all three data sets. But here we do see Trump attempting to steal the election. And there's a real subtext here around manipulation of the election, overt attempts to steal the election, and Donald Trump being placed as a sort of figure of fun in this context, but in such a way that it's clear that the cartoonists find these worrying behaviors in a broader context of democracy. So kind of having kind of wider ramifications potentially than just in the UK, than just in the US. And I did think that you know, the larger picture there at the bottom from the City Press of Take Our Country Back image was really quite a powerful image, and sort of, you know, the way in which that is expressed and kind of expressed a lot of the way in which Donald Trump was kind of portrayed throughout the cartoon set. Finally, I just wanted to make one final comment about the way in which politicians were portrayed during the pandemic. And although these ones don't relate to Donald Trump, they do share a number of similarities with the portrayal of the cartoons that do feature Donald Trump. These cartoons are both from the UK. They reference trust and sleaze, or the lack thereof, which was a major issue across the data set in relation to politicians. So where we had Trump being portrayed as the purveyor of misinformation or an election stealer, in this case, trust is overtly referenced, but in the context of Dominic Cummings, who was one of Boris Johnson's advisors. So this is the cartoon in the top. And Dominic Cummings was accused of breaking lockdown rules, and which led to a whole media discussion about there being one rule for us and another for politicians. And we saw a similar cartoon in Marina's data set around the ANC. So I think that sort of idea of politicians behaving badly comes out across the data sets in different contexts, you know, in relation to specific leaders of each of the countries. The other cartoon we saw earlier on in Marina's presentation, you may not have noticed it, but the UK was the only country in which education was explicitly referenced in relation to the COVID pandemic. And this relates to cartoons around the complete mishandling of our national exam system in the summer of 2020, which meant that the pupils were given their A-level grades, and then it was found that the algorithm had privileged children from public school backgrounds, so those who went to fee-paying schools. Public schools in the UK are fee-paying schools rather than state schools. And then this was then followed up with a complete change and backtracking, and led to a situation for universities where students were just awarded their teacher predicted grades, and universities had an awful lot of students that they weren't expecting. And in some senses, similar situation has happened this year around the awarding of, although there wasn't a kind of exams fiasco, but it's been quite difficult from the university's perspective, because students have been awarded grades in ways that are not the ways that we've been used to. So that's the end of my session, and I will just stop sharing my screen. And I'd like to open the floor for any questions, but unless anybody's quickly got a question, I think I did have some questions for my colleagues, and I wondered maybe we could kick off by discussing the role that you think that the cartoons have played in reflecting social anxieties throughout the pandemic, as opposed to maybe explicitly criticizing political action. Did anybody want to pick up on that thought amongst my colleagues? Because I've just been talking.
I can have a go, because I think the fear of the border fear was a really big thing that was represented, and even though political mishandling was present, it was real fear that we've got people in charge who aren't doing a very good job. So I think those fears were really there. As I said, PPE very early on. But later on, it was more that sense of this incursion. But Australia had an elimination strategy. So again, if we have one COVID case, the whole of Queensland goes into lockdown for 3 days. So a very different situation from a lot of other places. And I think we've seen that change over time, where now people are just sick of lockdowns, and there's not the same fear as there was. There's a lot more frustration, I think. So I don't know if everybody else feels the same way, but yeah, less unknown.
Yeah, I think, you know, I can't give you a decisive, you know, data, because we didn't specifically, you know, look for that contrast. But I think to the extent that cartoonists see themselves as speaking on behalf of people, you know, the ordinary people, the citizens of the country, speaking up on behalf of those who don't necessarily have a voice, I think to that extent they would have reflected social anxieties, because they were trying to be the voice for the people during the pandemic. And yeah, so I think that is true. That would be a prominent theme, definitely.
Elena, did you want to say anything about the UK data set?
Yeah, no, I'm thinking about all the cartoons that we analysed, but regarding the Observer, it was always more of a political stance rather than a social anxiety. But looking at the Telegraph, rather than social anxiety, I think it was social frustration. Because, I mean, over and over, there was this kind of, critics of the restrictions and the desire of freedom. There was also the call of a Freedom Day, and now scientists were blocking that and blocking Christmas. But yeah, it felt more as a frustration rather than an anxiety.
I think there's also, if I may add something to that, there's also a difference that I saw in the South African cartoons. On the one hand, there can be social anxiety about what we sometimes call jokingly here in South Africa first world problems, like having to have your children at home and not being able to go on your holiday. So those are, some concerns. But for other people in South Africa, lockdowns meant literally not having food in the house, not being able to make a living, literally the risk of starving. So, there are very different levels of anxieties amongst people in response to your social status, where in the country you belong, and in a very unequal society. And some of the cartoons, also showed that that lockdown had very different implications for depending on where you were in society and your income and your societal status. Yeah.
Anna, you've got your hand raised.
Yes, I thought, first of all, your presentations were absolutely interesting, and I love cartoons. And I think that they really are one expression of popular culture that it's absolutely interesting to analyze. And unfortunately, I would say they're often overlooked and considered, as I think maybe the problem is that they lie on a line there in between what could be considered news or part of the news and what can be considered comics and part of popular culture. But I think it precisely because they're on that line, I think they're absolutely interesting to analyze. And I was wondering, as I saw the kinds of newspapers that you were looking at and publications, but I was wondering, especially as you were saying about Donald Trump, that this way to criticize another country's leader, to criticize your own, and so, and somehow also the very fundamental element of blame shifting, as you were saying, that is something that I would say cartoons are, as cartoons do have this function to prompt an interpretation from the reader, and they are channeling and orienting this person towards an interpretation that is political, of course. So I was thinking, did you find that this element of blame shifting, and even related, not just to Donald Trump, but even related to the scientific aspects of the pandemic, so using the masks, the vaccines, and whatever else was going on, do you think that there was any stark difference between right and left leaning cartoonists? Was there some political element in that sense? Because as I will very briefly in my presentation, I will show one very right wing cartoonist, and I felt that in the US it was sometimes very stark when it was right wing. It was blame shifting towards China, towards the alleged origins of the coronavirus, while going along the spectrum, the political spectrum, going towards the left, that changes gradually. The blame shifting changes, And when you get to left wing, usually the blame is on the government for the failure of addressing the pandemic. So I was just wondering if you two, even if it's not maybe the focus of your study, but if you two, looking at so many cartoons, because I can see that you did a lot of work here. So if you felt that there was some kind of, dynamic in this sense too.
I mean, I can talk about that with Trump, because the Sydney Morning Herald, which is much more of the more left-leaning paper, I mean, they're both, everything's shifted to the right, but the less right was where we saw a lot of Trump and blame, and the Weekend Australian, which is considered the more conservative paper, much more about, that's where we see the cartoons about China and the issues around the China lab and those sorts of things. So there was, definitely that difference across who to blame for the pandemic problems. Yeah, for sure.
I think in the UK, so the Observer, being the left-leaning, was very heavy on the politicians. Very much, this was about politicians not doing a good enough job. But it was very entwined, as Elena said, with Brexit. So it wasn't necessarily the pandemic. Pandemic was part of it. It was part of a whole big mix of things that were going wrong at the same time. Whereas I think, and Elena, you might want to speak a little bit, but I think the right-wing paper of ours, which is fairly right-wing, was much more, we want our liberties back. So it was a civil liberties discussion. And I don't think we had the blame shifting in the same way. The blame shifting we had was with Boris blaming other members of his government for things and sort of saying, oh, good, they're doing the wrong stuff, so I can get away with doing something else. So the blame shifting was quite internal rather than blaming other people. So, but we had very, very few scientists in our data set. So I think there was I don't think there were any they were blaming the scientists, were there?
Not strongly. There was one where it's not clear if you're blaming the scientists for stopping the Freedom Day, so the removal of
that's true. Yeah,
it's not that strong there. But for example, there is it's not really shifting blame, but the telegraphs of the right wing tend to, if they portray negatively some politicians, then we have the European politicians, like we had Macron from France and Ursula von der Leyen from the European Commission. So, like for example, when there was already when they tried to block the vaccine to be delivered to the UK, then there was this negative portrayal, and there's not completely blame, but
yes. It was a negative portrayal, I think, rather than blame per se.
Yeah.
Marina, was there anything in your data set that looked at that?
I mean, there were a few references to China, critical, about the way that the pandemic was suppressed there, or the truth maybe was suppressed there. But what I did wanted to respond to something that Anna Marta said, and that was about, to what extent cartoonists have this license to criticize, maybe more than others, their own leaders or leaders of other countries. I think that's a very interesting observation. Do they sometimes go too far or not? In South Africa, cartoonists have been threatened with court cases and even taken to court by politicians before, not during COVID-19 so far, that I'm, but they've never actually won a court case. They've threatened with, millions of rands in, claiming damages or whatever from cartoonists, but they've never actually successfully. They've always ended up withdrawing the charges. So it's an interesting thing, but I mean, and that's one of the things that for me is an important role of cartoonists, is there are these fearless critics. I guess they can, or it's possible that they could go too far with their criticism if it's not founded, if it's not justified. But so, they obviously have a responsibility, and one never knows behind the scenes to what extent the editor of the newspaper and the cartoonist will negotiate about what is, permitted to say or not. I mean, there must be some negotiations going on, I'm sure, but it also speaks to me about the role of cartoons, because if you look at some of the literature long ago already, some people predicted the demise of the editorial cartoon because they thought it would disappear as printed newspapers came under pressure, because it was very much associated with print news media. But we see now that it's had a revival in online versions of newspapers. It's being shared a lot on social media, even if it appears first in print. So it's almost, I mean, I don't have data on that or anything, but from just what I've observed, it's almost as if the editorial cartoon survived longer and more strongly than people predicted. But it's also very interesting for me what you said about it being on this dividing line between journalism and commentary and social, popular culture, which sometimes makes it difficult to know how influential it is. And what would be very interesting to do, but very difficult, I guess, time and cost-wise, is to find out from readers, to what extent they sort of look. I mean, if I go through a newspaper, I always look at the cartoon. It's one of my highlights of paging through a newspaper or online. But to what extent, readers actually read it, comment it, share it, how important they think it is. That would be so interesting to find out. I don't know. I haven't seen a study like that. Maybe the newspapers have their own data about that, but because surely they decide to keep a cartoonist to pay. What I have seen though as well, sorry, last thing I'll just say is, during the COVID-19 pandemic, as newspapers are under pressure, we have in South Africa, across the board, across many newspapers, we've seen that some cartoonists were laid off. Some cartoonists were stopped. Their contracts were ended because the newspapers said they just couldn't afford it anymore. They were under too much pressure to survive. So, but not in the case of the 2 papers that we included in this study.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree that the social media have somehow given a new life to the political cartoon, because I think that, I don't know, you can see that people share whatever thing, and we have memes, we have all sorts of things, and the cartoon, I think, somehow can sort of fit in, because it's just something very the verbal message is very brief, if any is there, and the visual, if it's a good cartoon, because there are good cartoons and bad cartoons, of course, but if it's an efficient cartoon that does what it should do, I think it's such a powerful way to just condense a message, a meaning, and that works very well in social media. So I guess, and I don't know, and the cartoons that you were working with were in the newspapers, but did you find that maybe the cartoonists themselves or the newspapers were also sharing them online, I guess, and through their Twitter and stuff like that?
Yep.
Yeah,
they shared.
Definitely.
Yeah,
definitely. I think they're probably one of the things that newspapers use to hook people in. So I think they do have that role, that sort of slightly broader role now. And I think it is exactly as you're saying. It's because they visually capture the moment. They capture something that's salient in the public discourse at that moment. And I think that's really their role now. Probably always was their role now, but with social media, that means that there is that kind of opportunity to share them. And I would say that the newspapers in the UK also sell them, so you can purchase nice prints of political cartoons from newspapers in the UK. So they're also a money spinner, so different cartoonists also sell them on their, I guess they sell their work, obviously not because the newspaper would own the copyright for things in the newspaper, but yeah, I do think it's kind of interesting. You can pick out your favorite cartoon and have it printed up for hanging on your wall. Are we out of time now, I think?
Yeah, I think, well, we started a couple of minutes later, so this is not a problem, but I guess if there's no other question from the public, maybe we can just wrap this up. And I thank you very much, because it was very, very interesting panel. And I loved your presentations, and I think it's a very interesting work. And as I was saying, I think this is a type of text that it's important to analyze more, because it really does say something about the political climate, I find. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to you as well, to everyone.
Yes.
Yeah, and thank you. This is a great conference. What I've seen, I've really enjoyed. Yeah.
Well organized. Yes, thank you.